The Persian Corridor, Spies, Oil, and the Greatest Conspiracy Against the Big Three. A History for Sleep Tehran. November 1943. Three of the most powerful men on the planet are in the same city at the same time. Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, the leaders of the three great Allied powers, the men whose decisions will determine the shape of the post-war world, have come together for the first time in one place. If someone were to kill all three of them in a single operation, the consequences would be almost impossible to predict. The anti-Hitler coalition might fracture. New leaders would need time to establish themselves, to learn what their predecessors knew, to rebuild the relationships and the trust that had taken years to develop. The momentum of the Allied war effort might stall. A negotiated peace might become possible. The map of the post-war world might look very different from what it became. Someone in Berlin is thinking exactly these thoughts. But to understand why three of the most powerful men in the world are sitting in Tehran in November 1943, and why someone wants them dead, you need to go back 2 years, to a country that most of the world had barely thought about, and to a decision that changed the course of the war in ways that are still not fully appreciated. You need to go back to Iran. Get comfortable. I will tell you all of it slowly. The strategic situation of the Allied powers in the summer and autumn of 1941 was, to put it plainly, desperate. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, in the largest military operation in the history of warfare. Within weeks, the Red Army was in catastrophic retreat. Entire Soviet armies were being encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were being taken prisoner. The tank and aircraft losses were staggering, figures so large that they seemed almost impossible, the product of an army that had been caught off balance and had not yet found a way to fight the enemy it was facing. Britain and the United States, which had not yet entered the war, but was providing material support, understood immediately what a Soviet collapse would mean. If the Soviet Union fell, Germany would gain access to the oil fields of the Caucasus, the wheat of Ukraine, the industrial resources of the entire eastern half of Europe. The war would become almost impossible to win. The strategic balance would shift to a degree that no amount of American industrial production or British naval power could easily offset. Stalin needed help, and he needed it fast. The question was how to get it to him. The geography of the Soviet Union in 1941, looked at from the perspective of delivering military supplies, presented a limited set of options. Each of them had serious problems. The Arctic convoys, the route around the north of Norway to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, were possible but horrifically dangerous. The convoys ran through waters patrolled by German submarines and within range of Luftwaffe aircraft based in Norway. The losses were severe and the route was vulnerable to interdiction. In the summer months, the convoys had to run in near continuous daylight, making them visible and vulnerable. In the winter months, the weather itself was lethal. Storms that could sink ships, ice that could crush them, cold that killed men who went into the water in minutes. The Arctic convoys would make an enormous contribution to the war, but they could not carry everything that the Soviet Union needed, and they operated at a cost in ships and men that was barely sustainable. The Pacific route, delivering supplies to the Soviet Far East through Vladivostok, was possible as long as Japan remained technically at peace with the Soviet Union. But Japan could change its mind at any time, and even when the route was open, the journey from the American west coast to Vladivostok and then across the entire width of the Soviet Union by the Trans-Siberian Railway was enormously long and slow. It was useful, but not sufficient. There was a third route, a route that geography made possible, but that required something that geography alone could not provide: control of a neutral country that stood between the supply source and the destination. The country was Iran, and the supply route, once it was established, would be called the Persian Corridor. Iran in 1941 was a country in the middle of its own complex transformation. Reza Shah Pahlavi, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, a self-made autocrat who had risen from humble origins to seize power in 1921 and had ruled with an iron hand ever since, had spent the previous 2 decades trying to modernize his country. He had built roads and railways and universities. He had reformed the legal system and the military. He had suppressed tribal autonomy and imposed the kind of centralized control that he believed was necessary for a modern state. He was not a democratic ruler by any definition. His methods were frequently brutal, and his tolerance for opposition was essentially zero. But he had genuine ambitions for his country. He also had a problem, and the problem was Germany. Iran in 1941 had a large and influential German community. Approximately 2,000 German nationals were living and working in the country. Engineers, technicians, businessmen, advisors. Officially, they were there to help build the infrastructure of a modernizing state. The Trans-Iranian Railway, which ran from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Caspian Sea in the north, and which would become the backbone of the Persian Corridor, had been built with significant German technical involvement. German companies had contracts throughout the Iranian economy. But a significant portion of those 2,000 Germans were not simply engineers and businessmen. They were intelligence operatives working for the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, and for the SD, the SS intelligence organization. They had been studying Iran for years, its oil fields, its railway lines, its military installations, its tribal politics, its vulnerabilities. Iran was strategically located between the Soviet Union to the north, British India to the east, British-controlled Iraq and the Persian Gulf to the west, and the oil fields that both sides needed. It was a country that Germany wanted to keep neutral at minimum and to influence or control if possible. Reza Shah was trying to play all sides, as small powers caught between great powers often try to do. He maintained relations with Germany because Germany was useful to him. German engineers built his railway. German advisors helped train his army. German trade provided goods his country needed. He maintained relations with Britain because Britain controlled the oil company that extracted Iran's most valuable resource, and because British naval power in the Persian Gulf was a reality he could not ignore. He maintained relations with the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union shared a long border with his country and had a long history of interfering in Iranian affairs. What he could not manage was the situation that developed in the summer of 1941, when the two powers whose cooperation he most needed, Britain and the Soviet Union, became allies and decided that his country was too important to the war effort to leave in the hands of a man who was not fully under their control. The British and Soviet demands to Reza Shah were simple: expel the German nationals from Iran, all of them, immediately. The Shah made various responses. The Germans in Iran were mostly civilian experts, not military personnel. Expelling them would disrupt important construction projects. Iran was a neutral country and had the right to its own foreign policy. The Allies were not persuaded. On August 25th, 1941, Operation Countenance began. There was no formal declaration of war. There was no ultimatum that gave the Iranians a reasonable time to respond. British and Soviet forces simply entered Iran simultaneously from different directions. The British from Iraq in the west and from the Persian Gulf in the south, the Soviets from the north. The Iranian army fought back where it could. Individual units resisted with what weapons they had. Iranian aircraft, a small and antiquated air force, flew missions against the invaders before being destroyed on the ground or in the air. Iranian naval vessels in the Persian Gulf engaged the British and were sunk or captured, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Iranian army was not equipped or positioned to fight two major powers simultaneously, and the operation was over in less than a week. The Shah's government attempted to appeal to the United States, still officially neutral, to intervene diplomatically. The Americans acknowledged the message and did nothing. The German nationals in Iran found themselves in various situations. Some were arrested quickly by British or Soviet forces. Some managed to reach neutral territory. Some simply disappeared into the Iranian countryside, going underground and relying on contacts they had developed over years of residence. The intelligence networks that Germany had built in Iran did not evaporate when the Wehrmacht's clients were expelled. They went quiet and waited. Reza Shah, faced with the complete military occupation of his country, abdicated. He signed the documents in his palace in Tehran, and those who were present reported that the old autocrat, the man who had ruled Iran with an iron fist for 2 decades, wept as he signed. He was taken aboard a British ship and transported first to Mauritius and then to South Africa, where he died in 1944. In exile, never having returned to the country he had spent his life trying to build. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was 21 years old. He became Shah of Iran on September 16, 1941, in circumstances that were humiliating for any pretense of Iranian sovereignty. His country was occupied. His father had been removed by the occupying powers. The young Shah's authority existed at the pleasure of the British and Soviet forces that surrounded him. He would navigate these circumstances with more skill than his youth might have suggested, learning the art of survival between competing great powers that would define his reign for nearly 4 decades. But the immediate consequence of the abdication was that Iran was now, in practical terms, available to the Allies as a transit route. The Persian Corridor could begin. The physical infrastructure that made the Persian Corridor possible was the Trans-Iranian Railway, a construction project that stands as one of the genuine engineering achievements of the 20th century, largely forgotten outside of specialized historical circles. Reza Shah had ordered the railway's construction in 1927. The project took 11 years and was completed in 1938. It ran for approximately 1,400 kilometers from the port of Bandar Shahpur on the Persian Gulf to Bandar Shah on the Caspian Sea, passing through some of the most difficult terrain in the world. The Zagros Mountains in the west and the Alborz Range in the north presented obstacles that tested the limits of 1930s engineering. The railway crossed hundreds of ravines and valleys on bridges. It passed through the mountains in tunnels, 480 tunnels in total. In some sections, the gradient was steep enough that the locomotives of the era could barely maintain progress. The construction had cost thousands of lives. Workers from Iran and from dozens of other countries, including many Scandinavians and Central Europeans, who were imported as skilled laborers, died in accidents, from disease, from the brutal working conditions in the mountains and the desert heat of the lowlands. The railway was financed entirely from Iranian resources. Reza Shah had refused foreign loans specifically to avoid the kind of debt finance dependency that he had watched destroy Iranian sovereignty in the 19th century. The money came from a tax on tea and sugar, commodities that every Iranian consumed. The railway was, when it opened, an astonishing achievement. But it had been designed for the peacetime needs of a developing economy, not for the wartime requirements of supplying one of the world's largest armies. Its capacity was far too small. Its infrastructure, the stations, the yards, the maintenance facilities, was inadequate for the demands that were about to be placed on it. The ports at the southern end were modest facilities designed for the export of oil and the import of consumer goods, not for the handling of millions of tons of military equipment. When the Americans got involved, things changed rapidly. The United States entered the war in December 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The American commitment to the war effort in all theaters was immediate and enormous. Within months, American military engineers and civilian contractors were arriving in Iran with a mandate to transform the Persian Corridor into a supply route capable of moving the volumes that the Soviet war effort required. The scale of the American operation in Iran is one of the less known aspects of American involvement in the Second World War. At its peak, approximately 30,000 American military personnel and civilian contractors were present in Iran. The organization responsible for running the corridor on the American side was eventually called the Persian Gulf Command, and it operated with the kind of systematic efficiency that American industrial and military culture was particularly good at producing. The ports were rebuilt and expanded. New cranes, new warehouses, new handling facilities. The approach roads to the ports were improved. New railway yards were constructed to handle the traffic. The locomotive fleet was supplemented with American engines, powerful, reliable machines capable of hauling heavy loads over the mountain grades that had challenged the Iranian railway's original equipment. New repair shops were built to maintain the rolling stock. The signaling system was upgraded. The trucks. The Persian Corridor moved an extraordinary quantity of trucks. American trucks, primarily the Studebaker US-6, a heavy-duty cargo vehicle that proved exceptionally capable in the conditions of Soviet roads and Soviet winters. The trucks arrived at the Persian Gulf ports in crates, were assembled in Iranian workshops by American and Iranian workers, driven north over the improved roads, or loaded onto railway flat cars, and delivered to Soviet forces at the northern end of the corridor. Soviet soldiers who received these trucks gave them a name that stuck, Studer. The Studebaker became one of the most beloved pieces of American equipment in the Red Army. Not glamorous, not a weapon, just a truck, but a truck that was reliable when reliability mattered and capable of carrying loads that Soviet vehicles of the era often could not. The food. This is perhaps the aspect of the Persian Corridor that is most underappreciated in popular accounts of the Second World War. Among the 4 million tons of supplies that passed through the corridor were enormous quantities of food, canned goods, processed meat, flour, fat, sugar. Soviet soldiers called the American canned meat tushonka and ate it wherever they found it. The joke in the Red Army was that the Americans had opened a second front, but it was in a tin can, not in fronts. Stalin, in a rare moment of candor at the Tehran Conference, acknowledged to Roosevelt that without American food deliveries, feeding the Red Army would have been extraordinarily difficult. Marshal Zhukov, in a private conversation recorded after the war, was more direct. Without American supplies delivered through all 3 corridors, Arctic, Pacific, and Persian, The Soviet Union could not have sustained the war effort that ultimately destroyed the German army. But while the logistical machinery of the Persian Corridor was being assembled and operated, the intelligence war in Iran was reaching its most dangerous and consequential phase. The German intelligence networks in Iran had not been destroyed by the Allied occupation of 1941. They had gone underground. They had maintained contact with sympathetic Iranians, tribal leaders with grievances against both the British and the new regime in Tehran, nationalist politicians who resented the occupation, merchants whose German business relationships had been disrupted, individuals who had been recruited years before the war and who waited patiently for instructions. Among the most significant German intelligence assets in Iran was a man named Wilhelm Schulze Holtus. Schulze Holtus was a major in the SD, the SR's intelligence service, and had served as the German consul in Tabriz in northwestern Iran before the war. During his years in Iran, he had done what good intelligence officers do: learned the language, built relationships, understood the country. His Persian was not a diplomatic convenience, but a genuine fluency. He spoke it well enough to pass as a native in situations where that mattered. When the Allied occupation of 1941 made his official position untenable, Schulze Holtus did not try to escape. He went into the Iranian countryside and disappeared. He found his way to the Qashqai tribes of southern Iran, a confederation of nomadic and semi-nomadic people who had their own complex relationships with the Iranian central government and with the British, and who were not automatically hostile to a German officer who came to them with money, weapons, and promises of support for their autonomy. Schulze Holtus lived among the Qashqai for years. He took an Iranian name. He dressed as they dressed. He traveled with the tribes on their seasonal migrations. He learned their customs and their internal politics. And he worked, recruiting tribesmen, gathering intelligence about British positions and supply routes, organizing armed attacks on British convoys and installations, communicating with Berlin by radio when he could arrange it. The British knew he was out there. They had fragments of intelligence about a senior German officer operating in the tribal areas of southern Iran. They mounted operations to find him, using both their own forces and the cooperation of the Iranian government, which had every reason to want foreign intelligence officers removed from its territory. They could not find him. For years, Schulze Holtus operated in the shadow of the Allied occupation, a ghost in the mountains of southern Iran, training tribesmen, gathering information, waiting for the larger operation that Berlin had in mind. He would not be captured until 1944, and by then, the most dramatic episode of the German intelligence operation in Iran had already played out. Not in the tribal south, but in Tehran itself. The year was 1943. The tide of the war had turned. Stalingrad had been fought and lost. The German Sixth Army destroyed in the ruins of the city that bore Stalin's name, a catastrophe from which the German strategic offensive capability never fully recovered. The Allies had landed in North Africa and were fighting their way through Sicily toward the Italian mainland. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned against the German submarines. The war was going badly, and in the offices of the SD and the Abwehr in Berlin, increasingly desperate men were thinking about increasingly desperate measures. The decision by the Allied leaders to hold their first tripartite conference in Tehran, the capital of a country that was partly under Soviet military occupation, within reach of Stalin's secure communications, convenient for a man who disliked flying, presented what appeared to be an extraordinary opportunity. Kill all three of them, at once in a single operation. The name given to the plan was Operation Long Jump. The man tasked with planning and executing it was Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny's credentials as a special operations officer were, by the autumn of 1943, impressive. In September of that year, just weeks before the Tehran Conference was scheduled, he had led the raid that rescued Benito Mussolini from the Gran Sasso mountain resort, where the Italian dictator was being held after his government's overthrow. The raid was a spectacular success. Skorzeny's men landed gliders on a mountain plateau, overpowered the guards, bundled Mussolini into a small aircraft, and flew him to freedom. It was exactly the kind of audacious operation that Hitler loved and that made Skorzeny the most celebrated special operations commander in the German military. Now Skorzeny was thinking about Tehran. The concept was coherent. German agents would be infiltrated into Iran ahead of the conference. They would make contact with the existing German intelligence networks in the country, networks that had been maintained through the years of Allied occupation, including the contacts that Schulze-Holtus had cultivated in the tribal areas and the urban networks that had been kept alive by other means. The infiltrated agents would receive weapons, documents, and local support. And when the moment came, they would act. The first phase of the operation was to insert an advance team to prepare the ground. In mid-November 1943, a group of 6 German agents under the command of an officer named Eugen Holten was parachuted into Iran. Their task was to establish a radio link with Berlin, make contact with the local networks, and prepare for the arrival of the main assassination team. They landed in the dark in the mountains west of Tehran. They buried their parachutes. They made their way toward the city. They made contact with the local network and established their radio station. And they were noticed. Georg Vartanian was 19 years old in 1943. He had been born in Soviet Armenia but had grown up in Tehran, where his father had moved in the 1930s. His father was an agent of Soviet intelligence, the NKVD, operating under commercial cover in the Iranian capital. Georg had grown up in the intelligence world, absorbing its methods and its values as naturally as other children absorb the work of their parents. By the time he was 16, he was actively assisting his father's work. By the time he was formally recruited by the NKVD, he had already proven himself capable of tasks that most adults would have found daunting. In Tehran, Vartanian had built something remarkable. A small network of young people, his contemporaries, who lived in the city as ordinary residents, attending school, maintaining jobs, moving through the neighborhoods and the markets and the coffee shops, while gathering intelligence for Soviet handlers. They spoke Persian fluently. They knew the city the way only people who have grown up in it can know it. The shortcuts, the gathering places, the patterns of movement that tell an experienced observer when something is different. They were invisible in a way that adult intelligence officers, however skilled, often are not. When the preparations for the Tehran Conference began to accelerate in the autumn of 1943, Vartanian and his network were already in place, already watching. The 6 agents of Holten's advance team were relatively well-trained professionals, but they were operating in a city where Soviet intelligence had been present for years, and where Vartanian's young network was specifically designed to notice things that were out of the ordinary. The advance team made mistakes, small ones, the kind that only become visible in retrospect, but that are precisely what experienced counterintelligence people are trained to see. A face that appeared in the wrong neighborhood, a pattern of movement that did not match the cover story, a contact that was surveilled from the moment it was made. Vartanian did not move immediately. He watched. He followed. He allowed the advance team to move through the city, to make their contacts, to establish their communications. He wanted to see the full picture, not just the 6 men who had arrived, but the network they were connecting with, the safe houses they were using, the local agents who were supporting them. British direction finding equipment picked up Holton's radio traffic. Soviet intelligence was receiving the same signals. The picture was becoming clear. There was a German operation in progress. It was connected to the upcoming conference, and it was being run from a radio station somewhere in the city. The decision was made to act before the main assassination team could be inserted. In a carefully coordinated operation, Vartanian's team and Soviet intelligence officers moved simultaneously against the advance team and the local network they had connected with. Multiple arrests made within a short period to prevent any warning from reaching Berlin. The radio operators seized before they could transmit a final signal. Berlin waited for word from Holton's team. No word came. The silence from Tehran told Skorzeny and the SD what they needed to know. The advance team had been compromised. The operation was blown. Sending the main assassination team into a city where Soviet counterintelligence had just rolled up the preparation network would be sending them to their deaths or to captivity and would achieve nothing. Operation Long Jump was abandoned. On November 28, 1943, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill met in the Soviet embassy in Tehran for the opening of the conference. They shook hands. They sat at the same table. They discussed the plans for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France that would eventually become D-Day. They discussed the war in the Pacific. They discussed what the post-war world should look like, which countries should have what kind of government, how Germany should be treated after its defeat. They were alive to have these conversations because a 19-year-old Armenian boy who had grown up in Tehran had been paying attention. Georg Vartanian continued in Soviet intelligence for another 50 years. He worked in dozens of countries under dozens of cover identities. He became a hero of the Soviet Union. He married a woman named Gohar, who had been part of his Tehran network in 1943 and who served alongside him in intelligence work for the rest of their careers. His real name and the details of his work remained classified until the 1990s. When they were finally made public, he was an old man, and the world he had helped to save had long since been replaced by a new one. He died in 2012. While the intelligence war in Tehran was reaching its climax, the logistics of the Persian Corridor continued their enormous, unglamorous work. The scale of the operation is worth understanding in specific terms, because the abstract figure of 4 million tons does not convey what that actually meant in practice. Consider what 4 million tons of military supplies looks like when it is moving. Consider a port city on the Persian Gulf, Khorramshahr, which became one of the primary entry points for corridor supplies. The city had been a modest port before the war, handling oil exports and consumer goods imports. Now it was transformed. American engineers had built new dock facilities. Cranes towered over the waterfront. Warehouses stretched back from the water. A cargo ship would arrive, one of hundreds, the convoys from America, crossing the Atlantic and rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the route that avoided German submarines in the North Atlantic by going the long way around Africa. The ship would take a day or more to unload. Trucks, boxed in wooden crates, would be swung ashore by the cranes and stacked in the warehouses. Cases of canned food would follow, drums of aviation fuel, coils of copper wire, crates of machine tools, cases of boots, uniforms, medical supplies, then the assembly. The truck crates would be opened and the vehicles put together by teams of Iranian and American workers in vast open-air assembly yards. The smell of grease and new paint, the roar of engines being started for the first time, the long lines of completed vehicles waiting for the drive north. Then the journey north. The railway, upgraded by the Americans with new locomotives and improved signaling, would carry multiple trains a day through the mountains. The loads were limited by the gradients. Even the new American locomotives could only pull so much up a slope that had challenged their Iranian predecessors. But the volume, accumulated over months and years, was staggering. At the northern end, the ports on the Caspian Sea, Soviet officials would receive the deliveries. Soviet sailors would load the goods onto ships for the crossing to the Soviet Caucasus. Soviet railway workers would load them onto trains for the journey to wherever the front required them. Among the items that the corridor carried north, the copper wire deserves a special mention. Copper wire sounds undramatic. It is not a weapon. It does not feed soldiers. It does not carry troops into battle. But it is the essential material of electrical infrastructure, of the communications networks, of the industrial wiring, of the field telephone systems that allowed military units to coordinate their actions. The Soviet copper industry had been severely disrupted by the German invasion. Copper mines and processing facilities in the occupied territories had been lost, and the production capacity that remained was strained. American copper, delivered through the Persian Corridor, helped fill the gap. It is the kind of detail that gets lost in the larger story of tanks and trucks and artillery, but it illustrates something important about what industrial war actually requires. Not just the dramatic weapons, but the thousands of mundane materials without which the dramatic weapons cannot be used effectively. The same could be said of aluminum for aircraft frames, of steel for 100 purposes, of the industrial machine tools that were delivered in the bellies of cargo ships and assembled in Soviet factories, and then used to produce the weapons that Soviet industry was generating at rates that eventually overwhelmed the German capacity to replace its losses. The human cost of running this operation fell heavily on Iranians who had no say in any of the decisions being made. The Trans-Iranian Railway, built as the centerpiece of Iranian economic development, was now operated almost entirely in the service of foreign war aims. Iranian railway workers worked alongside American and British and Soviet personnel, often in conditions of organized chaos as the demands of the war effort pushed the system to its limits. The occupation brought inflation. The presence of tens of thousands of foreign military personnel with spending money pushed prices up for goods that Iranian civilians depended on. The military requirements of the occupying forces meant that food and other commodities were sometimes purchased or requisitioned in quantities that reduced local supply. In 1942, parts of Iran experienced serious food shortages. Not famine on the scale of occupied Soviet territories or the German-occupied parts of Eastern Europe, but real hardship that resulted in real suffering and real deaths among a population that had not chosen to be involved in any of this. The young Shah Mohammad Reza, formerly sovereign, practically constrained, attempted to navigate between the demands of the Allied powers and the interest of his own people. He was not always successful. The powers occupying his country were not particularly interested in the welfare of Iranian civilians when it conflicted with the operational requirements of the supply corridor. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of the Second World War. in places that were not the primary theaters of combat. The smaller countries on the edges of the great struggles, whose resources and geography made them strategically significant, without making them politically important to the great powers making the decisions. By the end of 1943, the Persian Corridor was operating at a level of efficiency that its planners had hoped for, but had not initially expected. The monthly throughput had grown from a few thousand tons in the early months to over 100,000 tons, and it was still rising. The American engineers had done their work. The system was running, but outside the carefully managed supply route, Iran was experiencing the disruptions that any country experiences when it becomes a theater of foreign military operations without having chosen to be one. The tribal politics of southern Iran, which Scholze-Holtus had spent years trying to exploit for German intelligence purposes, were also being actively worked by British intelligence. The tribes of the Zagros and the southern plains had their own relationships with the central government in Tehran, relationships that were often adversarial, and they had their own relationships with the British presence in the region, relationships that were equally complex. The British political resident for the Persian Gulf, the senior British official responsible for maintaining British interest in the region, had a network of contacts among the tribal leaders that predated the war by decades. The British approach to the tribal question was different from the German approach, where Scholze-Holtus was trying to organize active resistance. The British were trying to maintain a degree of stability that would allow the supply route to operate without disruption. They paid subsidies to tribal leaders. They made promises. They applied pressure when promises were insufficient. The competition between German and British influence among the Iranian tribes was one of the smaller dramas of the war in the Middle East, largely invisible in the larger narrative of battles and strategies, but real in its consequences for the people living in those regions. The tribesmen who were being recruited by both sides, the families in tribal areas who found themselves caught between foreign powers, competing for the loyalty of their men. The intelligence war in Tehran continued after the arrest that had disrupted Operation Long Jump. The German networks in the city were damaged, but not entirely eliminated. British, Soviet, and American intelligence all maintained active presences. The city was, in the intelligence terminology of the period, a hard target. A place where all the major powers were operating simultaneously, and where the competition between their intelligence services was continuous. Iranian intelligence, the country's own security services, was also active, though operating in the constrained circumstances of an occupied country. The new Shah's government had its own interest in understanding what the foreign powers were doing on Iranian territory, and those interests did not always align with the interests of any of the occupying forces. The Tehran Conference itself, when it finally took place in late November and early December 1943, was a logistical as well as a diplomatic achievement. The security arrangements for the conference were elaborate. Soviet, British, and American security services coordinated with varying degrees of trust in each other's reliability to protect the three leaders. The city was placed under intensive surveillance. Movement was restricted. The perimeters around the Soviet and British embassies where the conference was held were fortified. Roosevelt's decision to stay in the Soviet embassy rather than the American embassy, which was some distance away and would have required him to travel through the city, was made on security grounds but generated controversy both at the time and afterward. Staying in a facility controlled by Soviet intelligence meant that the American president's communications and conversations were potentially accessible to his hosts. Whether the Soviets took advantage of this opportunity is a question that historians have discussed without reaching definitive conclusions. What is certain is that the conference produced results of enormous historical importance. The agreement on Operation Overlord gave the Allied strategy its final shape. Stalin's commitment to entering the Pacific War after Germany's defeat laid the groundwork for the eventual Soviet declaration of war on Japan. The discussions about post-war Europe, about Poland, about Germany, about the spheres of influence that the great powers would exercise, began to establish the framework that would define the Cold War. The Shah of Iran was not a party to any of these discussions. The most important international conference of the war was held in his capital, and he was informed of it rather than consulted about it. After the conference ended and the great leaders returned to their respective war efforts, the Persian Corridor continued to function. The supply trains kept running north. The ships kept arriving at the Gulf ports. The trucks kept being assembled and driven to the Soviet border. The intelligence war also continued. Schulze-Holtus remained in the field in southern Iran until his capture in 1944. Other German agents, less prominent, continued the activities at reduced levels as the network was progressively disrupted by Allied counterintelligence operations. The urban networks in Tehran that had supported the long jump preparation were largely rolled up in the aftermath of the arrests. But intelligence operations do not end simply because one network has been compromised. Schulze-Holtus, when he was finally captured, was in poor physical condition. 3 years of living rough among the Kashkai tribes, through Iranian summers that were brutal in their heat, and Iranian winters that brought cold and snow to the mountain regions, had taken a toll that no amount of operational tradecraft could entirely prevent. He was a professional who had done his job under extremely difficult circumstances, and he had done it for longer and under harder conditions than almost anyone involved in the intelligence war in Iran could have expected. He survived the war as a prisoner and wrote a memoir of his experiences. The memoir describes a world that most readers had never imagined. A German SD officer living for years as a virtual member of an Iranian nomadic tribe, conducting guerrilla operations against the British Empire from the mountains, managing the complex relationship between a foreign intelligence officer and the tribal leaders whose hospitality he depended on, and whose loyalty he was trying to sustain through a combination of money, promises, and personal relationships that had become, in some cases, genuinely close. It is a document of the Second World War that does not fit easily into the standard narratives of the conflict. The great battles, the strategic decisions, the famous commanders. It is a story of the war's edges, the places where it reached into landscapes and cultures that had nothing inherently to do with the European conflict that had generated it. The war in Iran ended not with a battle or a peace treaty, but with a gradual wind-down that took longer than anyone had officially promised. Under the Tripartite Treaty signed in January 1942 between Britain, the Soviet Union, and Iran, all Allied forces were supposed to leave Iranian territory within 6 months of the end of hostilities. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The British and American forces departed more or less on schedule. The Soviets did not. What followed was the first major confrontation of what would become the Cold War. Soviet forces in northern Iran supported the establishment of 2 breakaway republics: the Azerbaijan People's Government in the northwest, centered on the city of Tabriz, and the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad near the Iranian-Iraqi border. Both were client states, dependent on Soviet military protection, supported by Soviet advisors, equipped in part with weapons that had flowed through the very supply corridor that the Soviet Union had used to survive the war. The Iranian government protested. The British government protested. The United States, under President Truman, took a harder line towards Soviet expansionism than Roosevelt had often done. The question was brought to the newly formed United Nations Security Council, one of the earliest tests of the institution that the Tehran Conference had helped to bring into existence. The pressure worked. Soviet forces withdrew from Iran in May 1946. The client republics collapsed without Soviet military backing. The Azerbaijan People's Government and the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad both fell within months of the Soviet withdrawal. Their leaders fled to Soviet territory. Iranian government forces re-established control. Iran remained independent. But the experience of the occupation years left marks. The young Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would rule for another 33 years after the Soviet withdrawal. He became increasingly authoritarian. He became a close American ally in the Cold War. In 1951, his country nationalized the oil company that Britain had controlled for decades, a popular move that led to a British-American-backed coup in 1953 that restored the Shah to power after he had been briefly deposed. He modernized the country on his own terms, with American support, and suppressed opposition with a secret police force whose methods were feared throughout his domain. In 1979, the Shah was overthrown in the Islamic Revolution. The revolution that toppled him drew on many sources: religious, political, economic, and its causes are genuinely complex. But among those causes was the accumulated memory of decades in which Iranian sovereignty had been treated as negotiable by great powers. The 1941 occupation, the 1953 coup, the long reliance on American support that had made the Shah seem to many of his subjects to be a foreign instrument rather than a genuine national leader. The Persian Corridor is one thread in this longer story. It is not the whole story, or even the main story, but it is present in the background, in the history of a country that found itself at the intersection of great power interests during the most destructive war in history, and that spent decades afterward working through the consequences of that experience. The mountains of Iran are still there. The Zagros and the Alborz still rise from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. The Trans-Iranian Railway still runs through them, carrying the freight of a developing economy through the same tunnels and over the same bridges that the wartime supply trains used. The supplies that flowed north through the corridor are long since consumed. The food eaten, the fuel burned, the trucks worn out and scrapped or repurposed. But they did their work while they lasted. They helped feed an army that was fighting the largest land campaign in the history of warfare. They helped fuel the aircraft that contested the skies over the Eastern Front. They helped carry the soldiers and the ammunition and the equipment that eventually, at enormous cost, broke the German army and ended the war in Europe. The three men who met in Tehran in November 1943 and made the decisions that shaped the final phase of the war and the beginning of the post-war world are all long dead. Roosevelt died in April 1945, a month before Germany surrendered. Churchill lost the 1945 election and was replaced as prime minister before the final Japanese surrender. Stalin died in 1953, the last of the three to go. The countries they led went their separate ways through the Cold War and beyond. Georg Vartanian, the young man who helped make the Tehran Conference possible by dismantling the German advance team before it could prepare the ground for the assassination, died in 2012 in Moscow, honored by the Russian state as a legend of Soviet and Russian intelligence. His wife Gohar survived him. somewhere in the mountains of southern Iran. There are places where Wilhelm Schulze-Holtus traveled and sheltered and conducted his long, ultimately unsuccessful intelligence campaign among the Qashqai. The tribes still exist. The mountains are unchanged. The memory of the German officer who lived among them is faint, present only in the memoir he wrote, and the scholarly articles that reference it. The Persian Corridor is quiet now. No supply trains are running its route for foreign armies. No American engineers are rebuilding its mountain stations. The war for which it was built is 80 years gone. The mountains are quiet. The story of the Persian Corridor, told only in terms of its logistics and its intelligence dimension, leaves out something important. The texture of daily life in a country that became, without its consent, a critical node in the machinery of the largest war in human history. Tehran in 1942 and 1943 was a city that had been transformed by the occupation in ways that were simultaneously dramatic and mundane. The dramatic changes were obvious. The presence of British, Soviet, and American military personnel in the streets, the new military vehicles that clogged the roads, the foreign flags over the embassies and consulates that were now operating at wartime intensity, the military police checkpoints that had appeared at strategic locations around the city. The mundane changes were in some ways more significant for the lives of ordinary Tehranis. The prices. Everything had become more expensive because thousands of foreign military personnel with foreign pay were competing with local residents for the same goods. Landlords raised rents. Food merchants raised prices. The bazaar, which had been the economic heart of Tehran for centuries, adapted to the new reality with the flexibility that markets always show in the presence of new money. But the adaptation benefited some and hurt others, and those who were hurt were usually the ones who could least afford it. The taxi drivers, the shopkeepers, the restaurant owners, the people who served the foreign military personnel, found new customers and new income. The families who lived on fixed incomes, the civil servants and the teachers and the small farmers who brought their produce to market found that their money bought less with each passing month. The specific texture of Tehran during the occupation years can be partially reconstructed from the accounts of people who were there. Foreign diplomats and journalists who left memoirs, Iranian writers who described the period in later years, the records of the various allied military and diplomatic missions. What emerges from these sources is a picture of a city that was simultaneously cosmopolitan and deeply uncomfortable, a place where the presence of four nations' representatives, British, Soviet, American, and Iranian, created a social world of unusual complexity. The British had been present in Iran, in one form or another, for well over a century. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later to become British Petroleum, had been extracting Iranian oil since 1908, and the British presence in the country had a history, a set of established relationships and resentments that predated the war by generations. British officials in Tehran in 1942 were not newcomers. They were the latest representatives of an imperial presence that many Iranians regarded with the specific suspicion that long familiarity can generate. The Soviets had their own history with Iran, a history of imperial Russian interference in Iranian affairs that went back to the 19th century, of the two countries sharing a border that had been the scene of repeated conflicts over influence and territory. Soviet officials in the northern occupation zone operated with a directness that reflected their confidence in their military position. The Americans were different. They were new to Iran. The United States had not had a significant political or economic presence in the country before the war, and they arrived with a combination of can-do efficiency and cultural obliviousness that was characteristic of American engagement with the world in that period. The American engineers who rebuilt the railway and the ports were good at what they did. They were less good at understanding the society they were operating in. They brought with them the assumptions of a culture that had not been colonized, that had not spent generations under the influence of powerful foreign states, and these assumptions sometimes made them poor readers of Iranian reactions to their presence. Iranian reactions to the American presence were mixed in ways that reflected this complexity. Some Iranians, particularly educated and professional Iranians who had absorbed aspects of Western modernism, found the Americans more congenial than either the British or the Soviets, partly because the Americans seemed less invested in maintaining the imperial relationships that the British and Soviets had built over generations. Other Iranians, particularly those with nationalist or religious orientations, saw all three occupying powers as equally foreign and equally threatening to Iranian sovereignty and Iranian culture. The young Shah navigated these distinctions with growing sophistication. He had been put on the throne by the Allied occupation, and he knew it. His legitimacy rested partly on the acquiescence of the occupying powers, and he was aware of this vulnerability. But he was also learning, in the crucible of the occupation, how to exercise what limited leverage he possessed, how to play the occupiers against each other, how to use the rivalry between the three powers to carve out a small but real space for Iranian interests. He would use these skills throughout his reign, with varying degrees of success. The lessons learned in the occupation years, the understanding of how great powers think about smaller countries, of what they want and what they can be persuaded to grant, shaped his political instincts in ways that were both useful and limiting. The operational history of the Persian Corridor is also a story about American industrial and organizational capacity that deserves attention in its own right, separate from the strategic narrative. The United States in 1941 and 1942 was in the process of transforming from a peacetime economy into the most productive war economy the world had ever seen. The factories that had been making automobiles were being retooled to make tanks and aircraft. The shipyards that had been largely idle in the Depression years were working around the clock. The organizational infrastructure of American industry, the management practices, the supply chains, the labor force, was being redirected toward war production at a pace that astonished both allies and enemies. The Persian Gulf Command was a small but characteristic example of this transformation. The American officers who arrived in Iran in 1942 found a supply system that was inadequate for the task assigned to it. They assessed the problem with the kind of systematic analysis that American military engineering had developed. They identified the bottlenecks, the port capacity, the railway capacity, the road network, the assembly facilities. They developed plans to address each bottleneck. They requisitioned the resources needed to implement the plans, and they built. The construction projects that American engineers undertook in Iran during the war years were substantial. New port facilities that could handle ships and tonnages the original ports had never been designed for. Railway yards with the capacity to sort and dispatch the volume of freight that the supply program required. Maintenance workshops that could keep the expanded locomotive fleet operational under conditions that were hardened machinery. The dust and heat of the Persian Gulf summer, the cold of the mountain winters, the demands of a wartime operational schedule that allowed little time for the careful maintenance that peacetime operations would have provided. The truck assembly plants were particularly significant. The Studebaker US-6 trucks arrived from America in crates that contained the disassembled vehicle, frame, engine, body panels, wheels, all the components packaged for sea transport. In the assembly yards at the Gulf ports, teams of workers would unpack the crates and assemble the trucks from their components. At peak production, these yards were putting together hundreds of trucks a week. The assembled vehicles were then either driven north, a journey that required drivers who knew the mountain roads and could manage the demands of high altitude driving with a loaded truck, or loaded onto railway flat cars for transport. The trucks were then handed over to Soviet personnel at the border. The handover was a logistical operation in itself. Paperwork, inspection, transfer of responsibility. The Soviet recipients had strong opinions about which vehicles they received and how they were configured. American and Soviet logistics officers negotiated over these details with the combination of professional respect and cultural incomprehension that characterized much of the American-Soviet wartime relationship. The Americans in Iran also dealt with the challenges of operating in a country whose climate ranged from the intense heat of the Persian Gulf Coast to the cold and snow of the mountain passes. Men who had been recruited for military service in the United States, many of whom had never been outside North America, found themselves dealing with temperatures that reached 50 degrees Celsius in the Gulf summer, with diseases that their immune systems had never encountered, with food and water supplies that required careful management to prevent the kinds of illness that can destroy the effectiveness of a military unit more thoroughly than any enemy action. The medical challenges were real and ongoing. Malaria was endemic in the lowland areas of Iran. Dysentery was a constant risk wherever water supplies were inadequate. Heat exhaustion claimed men during the Gulf summer. The medical units attached to the Persian Gulf Command spent much of their time managing these endemic risks rather than treating battlefield casualties. But the work was essential to keeping the command operational. The religious and cultural dimensions of operating in an Islamic country were a source of ongoing adjustment for American personnel. The behavior that was normal and unremarkable by American cultural standards, the way women were treated, the consumption of alcohol, the attitudes toward local religious practices, was sometimes deeply offensive to Iranians. American military commanders attempted, with varying success, to educate the personnel about Iranian cultural sensitivities. But the effort was imperfect and the cultural friction was real. The Iranian workers who worked alongside the Americans in the ports, in the assembly yards, on the railway, had their own perspectives on the American presence. Some found steady employment and relatively good wages in American-run operations, and this economic benefit was genuine. Others experienced the American presence as yet another form of foreign presumption, another set of foreign employers telling Iranians how to work in their own country. These are the textures that get lost in accounts of the war that focus on the strategic level. The decisions of the great leaders, the movements of armies, the statistics of supply. But they are part of the same story, the same reality, and they shaped the long-term consequences of the wartime relationship between Iran and the Western powers in ways that the strategists who planned the Persian Corridor did not fully anticipate. The intelligence competition in wartime Iran involved more than the German Allied confrontation that produced Operation Long Jump. It also involved competition among the Allied powers themselves, a fact that is sometimes obscured by the cooperative narrative that wartime alliance politics tends to generate. The British, Soviets, and Americans were formally allies, coordinating their supply operations through the Persian Corridor, toward the common goal of defeating Germany. But they were also competitors for influence in a strategically important region, and their intelligence services were actively working to advance their respective national interests in Iran, even as their military organizations cooperated on the supply operation. The British intelligence presence in Iran was the oldest and most established. MI6 and its predecessors had been operating in the country for decades, building relationships with Iranian officials, tribal leaders, and commercial contacts. The wartime expansion of British intelligence in Iran drew on this existing infrastructure. British intelligence officers in Tehran were working not only against German agents, but also against Soviet influence in the country. Watching the Soviet occupation of the North with the concern that had characterized British policy toward Russian expansion in the region since the 19th century, the Soviet NKVD and GRU, the civilian and military intelligence services, operated extensively in their occupation zone in northern Iran and maintained significant presences in Tehran. Soviet intelligence in Iran was working not only on the German threat. The long jump operation was the most dramatic manifestation of that threat, but it was not the only one, but also on building the networks and the influence that would allow the Soviet Union to pursue its post-war interests in the country. The Americans, newer to the region, were building their intelligence capabilities in Iran from a relatively low base. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor of the CIA, was establishing its first significant presence in the Middle East during the war years, and Iran was part of that expansion. American intelligence in Iran was learning the country, developing contacts, trying to understand the dynamics of a region that American foreign policy had previously largely ignored. The interaction among these three allied intelligence services in Tehran, the coordination that was necessary to protect the supply operation, the competition that was inherent in the different national interests, the sharing of intelligence that the long jump operation required, and the withholding of intelligence that national interests sometimes demanded, was a microcosm of the larger tensions within the Allied coalition. Those tensions would become much more visible and much more consequential after the war, when the cooperation of necessity gave way to the competition of the Cold War. The patterns that were established in wartime Iran, the Soviet attempt to expand its sphere of influence, the American resistance to that expansion, the British trying to maintain their own interest in the region, were patterns that would repeat in different forms across much of the globe in the decades that followed. There is a specific detail about the Tehran Conference that is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates something important about the relationship between the great powers and the smaller countries that hosted the meetings. The Iranian government was informed that the conference would take place in Tehran. The Shah received the Allied leaders and met with them briefly. The Iranian foreign minister was included in some of the ceremonial aspects of the conference. But the actual substance of what was decided, the plans for D-Day, the arrangements for the post-war world, the agreements about spheres of influence that would shape the lives of hundreds of millions of people, was negotiated entirely among the three great powers, without Iranian participation and with very limited Iranian knowledge. The decisions made at Tehran directly affected Iran's future. The agreement on post-war arrangements, the understanding reached at Tehran and refined at subsequent conferences, that the Soviet Union would have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, while Britain and America would have influence in Western Europe and the broader Western world, had implications for the Middle East that the conference participants did not fully articulate, but that were implicit in the larger framework. Iran's position in this framework was ambiguous. It was geographically adjacent to the Soviet sphere of influence. It had oil that Britain and America were determined to maintain access to. It was a country whose internal politics were complex enough that both the Soviet Union and the Western powers saw opportunities to advance their interests. The 1946 confrontation over the Soviet refusal to withdraw, the first Cold War crisis, was in some sense the first working out of the ambiguity that the Tehran Conference had left unresolved. The resolution of the first crisis, Soviet withdrawal under Western pressure, did not establish a stable equilibrium. It established a precedent that Iranian sovereignty could be maintained against Soviet pressure if Western support was forthcoming. But it also established a dependency. Iranian sovereignty required Western support, and Western support came with conditions. Those conditions would become increasingly apparent and increasingly burdensome in the decade that followed, as the Cold War hardened and the strategic importance of Iranian oil made the country a prize that both superpowers were determined to influence. The 1953 coup, the CIA and MI6 operation that overthrew the elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah after the oil nationalization crisis, was the most dramatic manifestation of what Western support actually meant in practice. It meant that Iranian democracy was negotiable when Iranian oil policy conflicted with Western interests. This is the longer arc of the story that begins with the Persian Corridor. It does not begin with the corridor, and it does not end there either. But the corridor is part of the chain, the sequence of events in which Iran's strategic importance made it the object of great power attention, in which that attention repeatedly compromised Iranian sovereignty, and in which the accumulated experience of compromised sovereignty eventually generated the revolutionary rejection of Western influence that defined 1979. History does not move in straight lines, and simple causal chains usually oversimplify the complexity of what actually happens. The Persian Corridor did not cause the Iranian Revolution, but it is part of the same story, part of the same experience of a country that found itself repeatedly at the intersection of forces it could not control. The supply convoys themselves, the ships that left American ports loaded with trucks and food and copper wire and machine tools and all the other materials of industrial war, had their own stories that the strategic narrative tends to flatten into statistics. The men who crewed those ships were merchant mariners, not military personnel in the traditional sense, but men who sailed cargo vessels as the profession, and who, in wartime, found the profession had become extraordinarily dangerous. The route to the Persian Gulf, south from the American East Coast, across the Atlantic, down the African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, north through the Indian Ocean, was long, and the ships were at risk throughout, not from the German submarines that threatened the North Atlantic convoys, but from Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean as Japan's naval reach extended westward. The men who served on these ships received less recognition than the military personnel who fought in uniform. The merchant marine in the United States was not a branch of the armed forces, and its members were not automatically entitled to the veterans' benefits that military service conferred. After the war, many of them found that the dangerous service they had performed, carrying the supplies on which the war effort depended, was not recognized in the way that military service was. This was an injustice that was eventually partially remedied, but not before many of the men who had crewed the supply ships had died in old age without the recognition they deserved. The Iranian railway workers who kept the Trans-Iranian Railway running under the demands of wartime supply, receive almost no attention in the historical accounts of the Persian Corridor. They appear, if at all, as a generic labor force, the background against which the American engineers and the Soviet recipients and the British administrators performed their more visible roles. But the railway required skilled workers, locomotive engineers, firemen, conductors, signalmen, maintenance workers, station masters. Many of these workers were Iranian, and they performed work that was essential to the supply operation under conditions that the wartime demands made harder than peacetime railway work. The railway was not a safe job in peacetime. The Trans-Iranian Railway, with its steep grades and its tunnels and its mountain passes, was an inherently challenging operation. In wartime, with the pressure to move more trains faster than the system had been designed for, with maintenance deferred in the urgency of keeping supply moving, with a workforce that was being asked to operate under the supervision of foreign managers who did not always understand Iranian working conditions, the job was harder and the risks were higher. Some of these workers are mentioned in the records. There are accident reports, there are personnel rosters, there are the dry administrative documents that any large organization produces. But the human reality behind those documents, the experience of the Iranian railway worker going to his job every day in a country that had been occupied without his consent, doing work that was essential to a war effort that was not his war, living with the knowledge that the occupation might end or might not, that the country might remain independent or might be absorbed into one or another great power sphere, is largely invisible in the historical record. This invisibility is not unique to Iran. It is characteristic of the historical record of the Second World War, as it was experienced in the countries that were not the primary protagonists, the countries that were theaters of war rather than makers of it, whose populations lived through the conflict as subjects of other people's decisions rather than as agents of their own. The Persian Corridor closed without ceremony. There was no formal end to the supply operation, no last convoy marked with special significance. The supply trains simply stopped running in the quantities they had run during the war. As the war ended and the need for them disappeared, the American personnel who had built and operated the supply infrastructure began to pack up and go home. The facilities they had built reverted to Iranian control. The Trans-Iranian Railway became again an Iranian railway, carrying Iranian freight between Iranian cities. The last American soldiers left Iran in 1946, in the same period that the Soviet forces were finally withdrawing under the pressure of the first Cold War crisis. The country that had been occupied by three foreign powers simultaneously for 5 years found itself, in the second half of 1946, sovereign again in the formal sense, though the economic and political legacies of the occupation would take much longer to work through. What the Persian Corridor achieved, measured against the purpose for which it was created, is not in doubt. The 4 million tons of supplies it delivered to the Soviet Union were a significant portion. Estimates suggest roughly a quarter of the total Allied supply deliveries to the Soviet Union over the course of the war. Combined with the Arctic convoys and the Pacific route, the American supply program provided the Soviet war effort with resources that supplemented Soviet production in areas where Soviet production was inadequate or had been disrupted by the German invasion. Whether the Soviet Union could have won the war without this supply program is one of the genuinely contested counterfactual questions of the Second World War. The Soviet Union was the primary military force. that defeated Germany on land. This is not in dispute. The Eastern Front was where Germany's military strength was destroyed, where the majority of German military casualties were suffered, where the resources that sustained the German war effort were ultimately exhausted. The question is whether the Soviet Union could have sustained its war effort at the level required for that destruction of German military power without the American supply deliveries. Soviet production by 1943 and 1944 was enormous. The relocation of Soviet industry to the Urals in 1941 and 1942, one of the most extraordinary industrial achievements of the war, had created a production base that was generating tanks and aircraft and artillery in quantities that the Germans could not match. But the food, the trucks, the raw materials, the industrial equipment that came from America filled gaps that Soviet production alone could not have filled. Gaps that would have constrained the Soviet military's ability to move and to fight. Marshal Zhukov's private assessment that without American supplies the Soviet Union could not have won reflects this reality. It is the assessment of the man who commanded Soviet forces in some of the most important battles of the war, who knew better than anyone what those forces required and what they had and did not have. His assessment is not a diplomatic courtesy, it is a professional judgment. The Persian Corridor was a significant part of the delivery system that made those American supplies available to Soviet forces. It was not the only part, and it was not the largest part. The Pacific route carried more tonnage overall, but it carried what it carried reliably and efficiently, and its contribution to the Soviet war effort was real. The mountains through which the railway ran are still there. The tunnels are still there. The bridges are still there. The passes are still there, carrying whatever freight the modern Iranian railway moves through them. They carry no memory of the wartime supply trains, except in the minds of historians and in the archives where the records are kept. The war itself is fading from living memory. The men and women who ran the supply operation, who worked on the railway, who served in the intelligence networks that competed in Tehran, the great majority of them are gone. The world they operated in is gone too, replaced by a world that was shaped in part by the decisions made in the conference rooms and the supply depots and the intelligence stations of wartime Iran. But that has moved so far from that world that the connection is difficult to see. This is how history works. The connections persist, but they become invisible under the accumulation of subsequent events. The Persian Corridor is invisible in this way, not quite forgotten, not quite remembered, present in the specialized literature and absent from the popular narrative. The story of how a neutral country was occupied, how its railway was used to supply the army that defeated Germany, how a teenage intelligence officer foiled a plot to kill three of the most powerful men in the world. This story does not appear in most accounts of the Second World War, or appears only in footnotes. It deserves more than a footnote. It is a story about how wars are actually fought, not only in the battles that define the strategic narrative, but in the logistics and the intelligence and the human experience of the countries and the people who live in the spaces between the battles. The space between the battles is where most of history happens. The mountains are quiet now. The railway runs. The corridor is closed. There is one more thread in the Persian Corridor story that deserves its own telling. What happened to the people who made the intelligence war in Tehran what it was in the years and decades after the war ended? Gevorg Vartanian lived a life that would be almost impossible to reconstruct fully, even now. After the Tehran operation, he continued working for Soviet intelligence. First the NKVD, which became the MGB, which became the KGB, for decades. He worked in countries across the world under cover identities that allowed him to operate without being identified as a Soviet intelligence officer. He spoke multiple languages. He and his wife Gohar traveled and lived in foreign countries as ordinary civilians, or as whatever cover their current assignment required, while in reality running intelligence operations on behalf of Moscow. The specific operations Vartanian conducted after Tehran are not fully known, even after the partial opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s. Intelligence services do not disclose their methods and sources simply because the operations are old. What is known is that he was considered one of the most successful intelligence officers in the history of Soviet and Russian intelligence, a judgment reflected in the honors he received and in the assessments of his colleagues that have become available in various accounts. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest distinction the Soviet state could bestow, while his identity remained secret. The citation did not name his specific operations. For years, there were people in the Soviet intelligence community who knew what he had done but could not say so publicly. This is the specific weight that intelligence work places on the people who do it. The inability to claim credit in public for the things that matter most. When Vartanian was finally identified publicly in the 1990s, and when the Tehran operation was acknowledged as his most significant achievement, he was an old man by then, in his 60s and 70s, living quietly in Moscow with his wife. He gave interviews. He spoke about the Tehran operation with the calm, matter-of-factness of someone describing events that had happened a long time ago to someone who had since become a different person. He said that he had not known at the time the full significance of what he was doing. He had been given a task: find the German agents, track them, neutralize them, and he had done it. Whether this had prevented the deaths of 3 world leaders, or whether the larger operation would have succeeded, even without the advance team, was a question he could not answer with certainty. He knew what he had done. He did not know, with certainty, what would have happened if he had not done it. His wife Gohar was a partner in this story in a way that is easy to understate. She had been part of the Tehran network in 1943, one of the young people who moved through the city, gathering intelligence and helping to track the German agents. After the war, she continued in intelligence work alongside her husband. They operated as a team, a working partnership that was also a marriage, the personal and the professional intertwined in a way that must have created both strength and particular difficulty. Vartanian died in 2012 at the age of 87 in Moscow. His wife survived him. The world they had spent their lives protecting had changed beyond recognition from the one they had known in Tehran in 1943. The Soviet Union that he had served no longer existed. The Cold War that his career had been conducted within had ended. The Tehran Conference, whose participants he had helped to protect, was ancient history. What remained was the record of what had been done, and the knowledge available now in ways it had not been for most of his life, that a 19-year-old boy in Tehran in November 1943 had done his job well, and that the job had mattered. Wilhelm Schulze Holtus, after his capture in 1944, spent the remainder of the war as a British prisoner. He was released after the German surrender and returned to West Germany. He wrote his memoir, Consul in the Hidden Lands, which described his years among the Kashkai with a vividness and a cultural sensitivity that surprised some readers who expected a conventional intelligence officer's account. The memoir describes not just the operations he conducted, but the relationships he built. the way he learned to live within a culture very different from his own, the genuine respect he developed for the Qashqai people and their way of life. It is a document of a particular kind of cross-cultural encounter, one forced by circumstances, conducted in the service of a government whose cause was already lost, but genuine nonetheless in the human connections it produced. The Qashqai themselves continued their lives after the war, navigating the same pressures from the Iranian central government and the same forces of modernization and change that had shaped their situation before the war. The weapons and support that Schulze-Holtus had organized for them had not changed the fundamental political situation of nomadic tribal peoples in a modernizing state. The wartime moment passed, and the longer-term dynamics reasserted themselves. The Trans-Iranian Railway continued to carry freight and passengers through the mountains that the wartime supply trains had used. It was extended and upgraded in the decades after the war, becoming part of a larger Iranian rail network. In 2008, UNESCO added the railway to its World Heritage List, recognizing it as an outstanding example of early 20th century engineering. The citation noted the extraordinary technical challenges that its construction had overcome: the 480 tunnels, the 300 bridges, the extreme gradients, without specifically mentioning the wartime use to which it had been put. Iranian railway passengers today travel through those tunnels and over those bridges on journeys between Tehran and the Persian Gulf coast, or between Tehran and the Caspian. The mountains outside the train windows are unchanged from what the wartime supply train crews saw. The engineering that Reza Shah ordered at such cost in money and lives carries the ordinary commerce of peacetime. The oil fields of southern Iran that the British were so determined to control in 1941 continued to produce. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company went through nationalization, denationalization, and multiple corporate transformations before becoming part of BP. Iranian oil policy has been one of the central issues in Iranian politics and in Iran's relationship with the outside world throughout the decades since the war. The specific grievances about oil that animated the 1951 nationalization, that Iranian sovereignty over Iranian resources was being subordinated to foreign commercial interests, are grievances whose roots extend back to the wartime occupation and before. The young Shah, who was placed on the throne in 1941 by the occupying powers, ruled until 1979. In those 38 years, he presided over an Iran that was transformed by oil revenues, that modernized rapidly in some respects while maintaining authoritarian political control, that became a close American ally, and then found itself overthrown by a revolution that defined itself in opposition to everything the American alliance represented. Mohammad Reza Shah died in Cairo in 1980, in exile as his father had died in Johannesburg in 1944 in exile. The parallel is one that neither man would have chosen, and that the son must have contemplated with particular weight as his own situation deteriorated in 1978 and 1979. The Islamic Republic that replaced the Shah's government has governed Iran for more than 4 decades. It is a state whose founding ideology was shaped in significant part by the experience of foreign interference in Iranian affairs. The 1941 occupation, the 1953 coup, the long dependence on American support that characterized the Shah's reign. The revolution was not simply a reaction to these events. It drew on religious traditions and political movements that had their own long histories. But the experience of foreign intervention gave the revolution's anti-Western ideology a concrete historical foundation that made it compelling to many Iranians. This is the long shadow that the Persian Corridor cast into the contemporary world. Not directly, not simply, not as a straightforward cause and effect, but as one element in a sequence of events: occupation, manipulation, dependency, resentment, revolution that shaped the political culture of a major country in ways that continue to affect its relationships with the outside world. The men who designed and built the Persian Corridor were thinking about winning the war. They were not thinking about the political consequences of their actions for Iran, because Iran was not their primary concern. This is not a criticism. In the circumstances of 1941, with the Soviet Union under catastrophic pressure and the outcome of the war genuinely uncertain, the immediate strategic priority was overwhelming. But it is a reminder that the consequences of great power decisions reach beyond the immediate strategic purpose, and that the countries where those decisions are made and implemented carry the consequences long after the strategic moment has passed. The supply convoys that left American ports loaded with trucks and food and copper wire served their purpose. The railroad that Reza Shah built with Iranian taxes and Iranian lives served its wartime purpose. The intelligence operation that Gevorg Vartanian ran in Tehran served its purpose. The conference that these things made possible served its purpose. The war was won, and Iran remained, carrying its own history, its own experiences, its own memories of what the wartime years had meant, into a future that the great powers who had used it did not fully shape and could not fully predict. The mountains of Iran are unchanged. The railway runs through the night, through the long tunnels in the rock, over the bridges above the mountain streams, through the passes where the snow lies in winter, and the summer heat shimmers on the stone. The war is over. The corridor is closed. The spies are dead. The mountains receive the night. The specific geography of the Persian Corridor, the route that supplies traveled from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, is worth following in detail because the physical landscape through which it ran shaped everything about how the operation worked. The Persian Gulf coast of Iran sits at or near sea level, in a flat coastal plain that extends inland for some distance before the land begins to rise. The climate here is among the most extreme on Earth. In summer, temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and the combination of heat and humidity near the water creates conditions that human beings find genuinely difficult to tolerate. The ports of Khorramshahr and Bandar Shahpur, the primary entry points for the wartime supplies, were built in this environment, and the American and British personnel who worked them in the summer months did so under conditions that required constant attention to hydration and heat management. The flat coastal plain gives way as you move inland to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The Zagros is one of the great mountain systems of the Middle East, a series of parallel ridges running roughly northwest to southeast, folded and complex, rising to elevations above 4,000 meters in its highest parts. The Trans-Iranian Railway had to find a way through this system, and the engineers who designed it chose a road that involved crossing multiple ridges through valleys and passes, with the tunnels punching through the ridges where no surface route was practical. The climb from the Gulf Coast to the passes of the Zagros is dramatic. In the space of a few hundred kilometers, the railway rises from sea level to over 2,000 meters. The gradients on some sections are severe enough that the wartime American locomotives, powerful as they were, had to operate carefully to maintain progress. Fully loaded supply trains took hours to climb sections that the modern traveler, looking at the map, might assume would be quick. Beyond the Zagros, the route passes through the high Iranian plateau, a vast interior basin sitting at elevations of roughly 1,000 to 1,500 meters, bounded by mountain ranges on all sides. Tehran sits at the southern edge of this plateau, backed against the Alborz Range to the north. The city in 1943 was far smaller than it is today, a population of perhaps 700,000 compared to the 15 million of the contemporary megalopolis. But it was already a city that concentrated the political and economic life of a country into a single urban center. North of Tehran, the Alborz Mountains present a second great barrier. The Alborz is geologically younger and more dramatic than the Zagros. Its peaks are higher, its ridges sharper, its passes more challenging. The highest point of the range, Mount Damavand, rises to 5,610 meters and is visible from Tehran on clear days, a snow-capped cone that dominates the northern skyline of the city. The railway threads its way through the lower sections of the Alborz, but even the lower sections required the engineering ingenuity that produced the long tunnels and high bridges that made the line famous. Beyond the Alborz, the land drops sharply to the Caspian coastal plain, a narrow strip of low-lying land between the mountains and the sea, with a climate completely unlike the rest of Iran. The Caspian coast is humid and green, with rainfall that would seem extraordinary to anyone who has spent time in the dry Iranian interior. The villages and towns along this coast have a different character from those of the plateau. Different crops, different architecture, different daily rhythms shaped by the moisture that the Caspian Sea generates. The Caspian Sea itself is the largest inland body of water on Earth. Technically a lake, though its scale makes the designation feel inadequate. It connects at its northern end to the great river systems of Russia, and its southern shore is Iranian. During the wartime supply operation, Soviet ships crossed from the Russian northern shore to the Iranian southern ports, loading the supplies that the railway had brought down from Tehran and carrying them back across the water to Baku and Astrakhan, where the Soviet railway network received them. This full route, from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian, through the mountains, was what the Persian Corridor actually was, in physical terms. Not an abstraction, not a logistical concept, but a specific landscape with specific characteristics that shaped every aspect of the supply operation. The engineers who built the railway and the American officers who upgraded it had to work with this specific geography, and the geography set the constraints within which they operated. The wartime experience of this landscape was particular to those who lived it. The American soldier in a supply depot on the Gulf Coast in July 1943 experienced the landscape as oppressive heat and blinding light and the smell of oil and sea salt. The railway worker in the Zagros passes in January experienced it as cold and altitude and the specific quality of silence that mountain regions have when the wind drops. The driver of a supply convoy on the road north of Tehran experienced it as long grades and switchbacks, and the view, on clear days, of the Alborz rising ahead. The Iranian farmers and villagers whose land the railway and the supply roads crossed experienced it as the presence of foreign machinery and foreign personnel in landscapes that had been their own. The supply trucks that passed through their villages brought dust and noise, and the occasional accident and the specific disturbance of ordinary rural life that any heavy traffic produces. The railway that ran through their fields had been built before the war. with the promise of connecting the communities to the wider Iranian economy. During the war, it was used primarily for foreign purposes that they did not control and from which they derived little direct benefit. There were Iranians who benefited economically from the supply operation, merchants who sold goods to the Allied forces, landowners who leased property for military use, workers who found employment in the ports, and the railway and the supply depots. There were Iranians who were harmed, farmers whose crops were purchased at imposed prices, communities whose local food supplies were reduced by military requisition, workers whose wages did not keep pace with the inflation that the occupation brought. The net economic effect of the occupation on Iran is difficult to calculate with precision, partly because the data that would allow such a calculation does not exist in the form that economic historians prefer, and partly because the effects were so unevenly distributed that a simple net calculation would obscure more than it revealed. Some Iranians were substantially better off in material terms because of the occupation. Others were substantially worse off. The distribution of these effects was not random. It followed existing patterns of social advantage and disadvantage in ways that tended to reinforce existing inequalities. The political effects, the damage to Iranian sovereignty, the resentment of foreign presence, the memory of being used by great powers for their own purposes, were more uniformly distributed. Iranians across the social spectrum shared the experience of living in an occupied country, of seeing the government's authority overridden by foreign military commands, of watching their Shah deposed and replaced by his son at the pleasure of foreign powers. These shared political experiences are part of the foundation on which the subsequent political history of Iran was built. The nationalism that motivated the oil nationalization movement, the anti-imperial sentiment that the Islamic Revolution eventually channeled into a comprehensive political transformation. The Persian Corridor is one component of this foundation, not the only one and not the most important one, but present. The 4 million tons of supplies that passed through the corridor reached Soviet forces through a distribution system that was itself an extraordinary logistical achievement. Once the supplies crossed the Caspian to Baku, they entered the Soviet railway network and began the long journey to wherever the front required them. The Soviet railway system in 1942 and 1943 was operating under enormous pressure. The German advance had destroyed or captured large sections of the Western network. The relocated factories of the Urals were generating enormous freight demands, and the military supply requirements of the largest land campaign in history were competing with all other uses of the available rolling stock. The fact that the Soviet railway system continued to function under these pressures, that it continued to deliver supplies to the front, to evacuate wounded, to move industrial equipment to the new factory locations east of the Urals, is one of the less celebrated achievements of the Soviet war effort. Soviet railway workers and engineers maintained and operated a system that was simultaneously being destroyed by the enemy and being asked to carry freight volumes that peacetime planners had never anticipated. The American locomotive deliveries through the Persian Corridor were a specific contribution to this effort. The Soviet railway network before the war had been built primarily around Russian-manufactured locomotives, and the losses of the German invasion had reduced the available fleet significantly. American locomotives, designed for American conditions but adaptable to Soviet requirements, helped fill the gap. Soviet engineers and drivers who operated these American machines reported favorably on their reliability and their performance under the demanding conditions of Soviet wartime railway operations. The copper wire that came through the corridor powered the communications infrastructure that allowed Soviet commanders to coordinate their operations. The aluminum that came through the corridor went into the airframes of the Soviet aircraft that contested the skies over the Eastern Front. The machine tools that came through the corridor were installed in Soviet factories and used to produce the weapons that the Soviet army needed to fight. These connections between the supply operation in Iran and the specific military capabilities that it helped to sustain are what make the Persian Corridor more than a logistical footnote. The corridor was part of the infrastructure of the Soviet war effort, and the Soviet war effort was what destroyed the German army and ended the war in Europe. The connection is indirect and mediated by many intermediate steps, but it is real. The end of the corridor, the gradual wind down of the supply operation as the war ended and the American personnel departed, was anticlimactic in the way that endings of this kind often are. The last supply trains ran, the last ships were unloaded, the last American personnel were repatriated. The facilities that had been built for the war were handed over to Iranian authorities or simply abandoned. The machinery of the supply operation, the cranes, the locomotives, the trucks, the warehouses, was dispersed or left in place. What remained in Iran was the ordinary aftermath of the extraordinary. A country trying to return to its own life after years in which that life had been interrupted by forces it could not control. The Trans-Iranian Railway running through its mountains, carrying now Iranian freight for Iranian purposes. The oil fields of the south still producing under arrangements that would soon be contested in the nationalization crisis. The young Shah in his palace, trying to consolidate his authority in a country that had seen its sovereignty treated as negotiable. The Persian Corridor had served its purpose. The war had been won. What came next was for Iran to work out on its own, or as much on its own as a country in the strategic crosshairs of the Cold War could work anything out on its own. The mountains of Iran are indifferent to these human calculations. They stand as they have stood for millions of years, receiving the seasons, channeling the rivers, carrying the railway through their passes. They do not remember the wartime supply trains. They do not remember Holtus hiding among the Kashkai in the Zagros foothills. They do not remember Vartanian moving through the streets of Tehran below their northern ridges. They simply stand. The railway runs through them tonight, as it has run every night for nearly 90 years, carrying the freight of a country at peace. The corridor is closed. The war is over. The mountains are quiet. Sleep now. The end